104 weeks to flatten the curve. Lessons learned by F&B operators during 2021 and how they will impact real estate, design, and guest interaction in the years to come. Presented by Mr. David Denney, the Denney Law Group out of Fort Worth, Texas.
Dallas, Texas.
David is his longtime friend of ours. He represents primarily independent restaurants, bars, caterers, ghost kitchens, food halls, chefs, and he was the first one to kind of introduce to me the concept of ghost kitchens and how they work and how they operate, and it was very insightful. You're going to love what he has to say. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Denney.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Even though Kendall said everybody's tired about hearing about the pandemic, that made me very sad because we're about to hear about the pandemic, but hopefully in a good way. So she didn't poison the well too deeply on that for me. So I think that I have an interesting perspective because I only represent independents, and depending on the day, 95 to 97% of our firm's clients are restaurants and bars and people in the independent F&B space. And so on March 20th of 2020, I canceled all my firm's magazine subscriptions because I was pretty sure we were going under and didn't know where that was going to lead, because for a lot of years it seemed smart to put all those eggs in one basket until the basket got stepped on by the world. So let's hit it. We've got some limited time here. So it wasn't worth going through if we didn't learn something. So what have we learned from these 104 weeks or so to flatten the curve? And by the way, we're not out of the woods yet, so hopefully we have a few minutes. And the pandemic is waning, but we've got other things on the horizon we need to worry about. For some reason, I felt musically inspired, and so I found lyrics from a bygone era to guide us as we go through this. So lesson number one, don't spend all the government cheese. I wonder if that, Okay, so if you followed the PPP rules and you took all the PPP money early and you spent it on all of your employees like it was intended, and or rent while you were closed, and then that money ran out and the pandemic had not ended like everybody hoped it would, and you didn't have that government money, you were in a much worse state than you were if you held on to it for a rainy day and put your employees into unemployment. And it turned out that people who followed the rules pretty meticulously ended up getting screwed because they spent all the PPP money and then they did not have that for operating cash that they really needed when the pandemic started to wane. Even completely through PPP1, everybody pretty much spent the money. PPP2, people got a little wiser and didn't spend all the government money, but it wasn't fully utilized for its intended consequences. And so there was a huge disconnect between the government's intent to flow money through businesses to get it to employees and to the businesses to pay those employees and or to also recover from the government shutdown that occurred in the hospitality industry. And so the lesson here is be more cognizant of what you do with the government money if it comes again. We saw three different kinds of government money. We saw PPP, then we saw EIDL, Economic Impact Disaster Loan, then we saw Restaurant Recovery Act. Restaurant Recovery Act only lasted about 2 weeks. A few $1 billion went out of it, and then they put a moratorium on it, and then the Restaurant Recovery Act was taken away to pay for Build Back Better. And so there is still a sense that the government has not fully put enough resources into the hospitality industry to recompense for the disastrous 18 months that they suffered under some closures. Pay attention to the new rules. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's at the bottom, but it's the tax man. So when we have laws that change, and they've changed rather abruptly, it's best to look at how they affect your business. And it seems very simple to say, hey, if the law changes that affects me, I need to know how it applies. And yet we had to-go alcohol as as we talked about yesterday, codified in our last legislative session. It was a godsend. It's wonderful. We love it. We weren't the early adopter. We're probably the 30th state to do it, but I'm glad we have it. But in Texas, mixed beverage permittees pay different taxes for on-premise sales as opposed to off-premise sales. On-premise sales are taxed at a higher rate. Off-premise sales only pay mixed beverage sales tax. So when you're selling a bottle of wine to go with a mixed beverage permit, when you're selling a keg of beer to go, when you're selling mixed cocktails, you don't have to pay the full 14% tax. And people, I'm shocked at how many people have been doing this for a year and a half and are paying 14% tax. That's crazy to me, because that's a lot of money, and they're paying 100% more tax than they're supposed to. And getting that back from the comptroller or whatever your taxing authority is very difficult. And so when it's imperative that we as practitioners keep an eye on the legislative changes that are going to affect our clients, and I think be more proactive. It didn't occur to me that I needed to send out an email blast that said, don't pay too much tax. I mean, there are people for that are not me. And yet I feel now compelled to, just because anecdotally, I'm hearing people saying, what do you mean I don't have to pay mixed beverage excise tax on my off-premise sales? Enough times I've heard that, it's time for a MailChimp or something, because we've got to address it. So off-premise here is taxed differently. I just can't understand how people didn't know about it. And so it refocused my practice on how to, on the client contact perspective of how do we ensure that people are at least paying attention. They were very happy to get to-go alcohol. They were very focused on the rules around packaging and delivery and figuring out the logistics of service and not the back office. How do I program my POS system for on-premise versus off-premise so that I'm not overpaying on tax? I hate pivot. I hate that word. It's so overused, and yet it's indicative of how we dealt with the last 2 years. And Stephen just walked out, so I will still commend him on his pivot yesterday, allowing people to not wear masks if they didn't want to. That is the kind of thing we have to be creative and be ready to make a change to adapt to our circumstances. And so we saw, oh, there's another. Why are these coming in at the bottom? The times they are changing, right? So we have to pivot. If we see another pandemic, if we see another government closure, and if we see changes that we're seeing now in commodities markets that we'll talk about in a minute, we have to be ready to adapt. And so we have seen, and I spoke, I think, last year at the virtual conference about some of the amazing changes and adaptations that our clients made, whether it was going online and engaging with guests through Facebook Live, Instagram Live, selling pre-made meal kits and then cooking them on live on the internet to engage with their clients or with their customers during pandemic. A lot of them are still doing that, even as they are rebuilding their businesses. We watched extremely high-end steakhouses and fine dining transition into to-go and curbside pickup, which you would have never expected. And I mean, it would have never occurred to me to go buy a porterhouse from a steakhouse and pick it up at the curb and take it to my house and eat it. And yet they had no mechanism to give that to me or anybody else on a large scale. And so we saw people shift to go delivery and to third-party delivery. And if you guys know me at all, you know that I feel like most of the third-party delivery companies were war profiteering during COVID, and yet they became a necessary evil. So there had to be a partnership there between third-party delivery companies and the vast majority of the F&B outlets, simply because traditional F&B doesn't have its own delivery mechanism unless you're Chinese food or pizza. And so we saw lots of really good changes that will stick with us. One of those is in restaurant design, whether it be QSR or counter service, fast casual, or even table service. We're going to see elements of restaurant design inside hotels, in standalones, in strip centers that are necessitated by the fact that more guests are comfortable with to-go and delivery. And so we may see pickup windows that are cut into new spaces. We may see new throughput avenues. We're going to see new counter surfaces and new lines simply for third-party delivery drivers to come and pick up food to get them out of the way of dine-in customers. And so I'm including that because I want you guys to be ready for, and even in hotel restaurants, there is some component of third-party delivery that's being utilized. And so to the extent that we can segregate the third-party delivery avenues away from main dining, it improves the experience both for the third-party delivery driver and customer, and also for your dine-in guests. So we're seeing a lot of that. And some of it is just cubbies for pickups, because now everybody has integrated POS systems where they'll have Caviar and DoorDash and Grubhub and Uber Eats, and they have to figure out where those tickets going to be picked up. And so they might have a cubby system for DoorDash. They might have a cubby shelf, or a stack of cubbies for Uber Eats and things like that. And so they're not the most elegant design features in a restaurant. And so you want to be thoughtful as you're designing new units and accommodating existing units about how that's going to work. So I've said it before, and I'm going to keep preaching this. If you cannot get third-party delivery fees out of your gross sales calculations, whether you're a franchisee, or you have a management agreement with a hotel, or especially for percentage rent, you're dead meat. Because if you're paying 30%, the way that they calculate, the way that you pay third-party delivery is you get the gross receipt and the restaurant, and then the third-party delivery company sends you a bill. So you pay that third-party delivery 30% later, but the whole amount isn't calculated in your gross sales, but you don't get to recognize that. And so for years, we've been getting credit card fees out of gross sales. It's 3%. This is 30%, potentially 15 to 30% of those sales. And when third-party deliveries are 40% of your revenue, and you're paying 30% of that out in fees, and you're paying percentage rent on 100% of it, you're in big trouble. It's unsustainable. And so I just negotiated a franchise agreement for a franchisee, and I got third-party delivery fees out of the calculation of gross sales on which the royalties were calculated. It was the first time I've ever accomplished that, but it's the same theory, because the third-party delivery companies are not set up to deduct it when it's charged to you. It would be so much easier if it just never hit the cash register, but it does. And so until we figure out a way to get that dealt with, it has to be addressed, especially in legacy leases or management agreements where they've been in place for 10 or more years and there was no third-party delivery. So yes, I know that I've beaten that dead horse a few times, but it's still like critically important because 2 years ago, or maybe in 2019, when I talked about, oh, third-party delivery is really catching on, that was my presentation here. And now it's third-party delivery is an integral part of the food service industry, and we cannot get rid of it. And so we have to adapt and work with it. The other thing we found out is that we need more robust force majeure clauses. So rarely did we see leases that talked about a pandemic, and only large commercial leases where they had counsel that knew about bird flu did anyone see the word pandemic in a force majeure clause. They do exist. They're just not that frequent. What we're litigating now is the fallout from 2020, 2021 in litigation with landlords over force majeure clauses that are pretty general, that talk about acts of God. They talk about government edict. They talk about things beyond the control of a party, all of which encompasses 2020 and 2021. And so if you're lucky enough to have well, from my perspective, it's all tenant. So if I have some leases that I am lucky enough to have force majeure clauses that do not exempt the payment of money from the force majeure. And so we had clients that could not pay rent for almost a year. And force majeure says, you're excused from performing if any of these happen, typically your lease force majeure will say, force majeure doesn't apply to payment of money. You have to keep paying us rent. That's about what 90% of the force majeure clauses say in these commercial leases. If you don't have that, you have a litigation on your hands because you could have been in force majeure for a year. And that's a jury question. And so we're going to see some interesting, we won't see appellate opinions on this probably for another 18 months. But the litigation on force majeure is really hot right now, and it's taking up a great deal of my time. And so what we have done is in the leases that we negotiated or renegotiated during 2020 and since, we have put a pretty specific and what I think is a pretty good force majeure clause that I'm going to share with you guys, specific to pandemic. Signed, sealed, delivered. I'm your Stevie Wonder. We want this signed, sealed, and delivered. So we have about 3 different force majeure clauses that we are using for pandemic, depending on what kind of lease it is. But I wanted to share this with you guys, because I think it's pretty universal in its fairness and how it works. And so this will be in the PowerPoint presentation that's available to you guys if you are so inclined. And if anybody makes it better, send it to me, because I'd love to see your input. But this basically says, hey, if we get shut down by the government again for something similar to COVID-19, like, COVID 2023, we'll pay a percentage of sales back to you, which is the fairest way to do it. Because if you're completely dark, you're not paying rent. And if you're open 50% capacity, then you're making less money. And so if you can't do that, then you're going to end up getting evicted and losing your space. And so as a result, I think we had 2 clients go under during COVID. Of the hundreds of units that we represent, we only had 2 go under, and both of them were landlord related. One of them didn't have any more renewals and was so afraid to reopen, they never reopened, and the landlord said, you haven't been open for over a year and we're not going to give you any more renewals, and so we're going to just take your space back. And it was a really unfortunate outcome. And the other one that went under was just pandemic wrecked their business, and landlord came after them. We got an injunction against the landlord. We got a TRO against the landlord, then we got an injunction against the landlord, then the client ran out of money, went out of business. So we were well on the way to winning that force majeure case, I think, but we didn't. It ended. So you have to be very thoughtful about your hotel agreements and your leases with regard to what we might see in the future. And again, this is just lessons learned. No one knew how specific we had to be to address some of these things that we dealt with, because it was completely unprecedented time. And so now, no, I want to go back. So now what we're dealing with, there was a news article that came out yesterday or Monday, and I just want to give you some figures about what we're dealing with now. And it's not all pandemic related, and it's not all war in Europe related, and it's sort of just, we're in a time of, as John Eldridge would say, global trauma. We've all lived through global trauma, and we're not out of the woods yet. So between January and February of 2022, gas went up 6.6%. Grocery prices went up 1.4%, highest since 1990, the highest 1-month increase since 90. Fruits and vegetables went up 2.3%, highest month increase since 2010. In the last year, gas has gone up 38%. Grocery inflation is at 8.6%. That's the highest since 1981. Housing costs, which impacts construction and the things that we do commercially also, 4.7% increase, highest since 91. So sorry, grocery inflation, highest since 81. Housing, 4.7% increase, highest since 91. And then we are anticipating that chicken will be up 70% year over year by mid-2022 because of the cost of feed. We also know that Ukraine and Russia have a lot of sand. Seems like, who cares about sand? Well, what do we need it for? We need it for glass. So if you remember back during 2020, what couldn't you get? You couldn't get Topo Chico, and you couldn't get Fanta. Because why couldn't you get Fanta? Well, there was an aluminum shortage, and Coke and Pepsi and Bud Light got all the cans, and people like Fanta didn't. And so if you don't have sand, you can't make glass. And if you don't have glass, you don't have bottles. So we're going to be looking at some really interesting supply chain issues. It isn't just, oh, all the shipping containers are in the port. It's, we have commodity issues of production that can't get the commodities to the shipping containers into the port so they can get backed up so that we can maybe get them. We also know that I had clients in 2021 and 2022 that were using evidence bags that they ordered online that are used by police departments as their to-go bags because they couldn't get paper products. I mean, and it looked really cool because that wasn't a 5-star restaurant, but it looked really cool to get your to-go or your takeout delivery in an evidence bag, but it also looked a little weird, right? And that shocked me. I was like, what is this? That's all we could get. It was the only bags we could get. We had to buy, we bought 10,000 of them. Like, we were trying to get creative. So the war in Ukraine right now is affecting wheat, corn, cooking oil, aluminum, and glass. Just right now. Last week, lobster went up 100%. So I don't know if you've ever paid $50 for a lobster roll, but you're gonna if you want one. And that is the new today, and we have to be able to address it. So what are our clients doing? Some of them are so focused on reopening and making up the delta that they lost during the pandemic that they don't have time to focus on commodity price fluctuations. But if they are not trying to do that and not trying to hedge or figure out some plan for the next 6 to 12 months, because they're looking backward, trying to replace the red on the ledger from the last 104 weeks, they're going to be sorely disappointed when they figure out they can't get any chicken wings and the price of chicken is up 70% when they make their US Foods order. It could be devastating. I mean, chicken is like the #1 protein. I don't know. I'm just making that up. I don't know. It maybe beef is. Chicken's pretty important. If chicken goes up 70%, people are going to be pissed, but they have to figure out a way around it. So we talked about the cartel avocados yesterday, right? I went to a place where I order the same thing every time consistently when I go, and it's an avocado salad, and its diameter shrunk by an inch. The price didn't shrink by an inch, but the diameter of the salad, because they set it on top of a tortilla, so I knew it actually had a baseline, and it shrank by an inch. And I was pissed because I know it's different than our favorite coffee company increasing a cup by 10 cents and nobody caring. I mean, that was a significant quantity issue, and that is the kind of thing people are having to do. And they're just like crossing their fingers, praying that nobody cares or nobody notices, or that if they do notice, they don't care. And so, but we have to be very strategic, and we can't silo ourselves into we are lawyers, we're going to read contracts, we're going to deal with insurance companies. We have to be more proactive as counselors and take off our lawyer hat and say, are you aware of this? Do you know this is happening? How are you getting information about commodity prices? If you were looking at Nation's Restaurant News, that is old. It had to go to print, it had to go to the internet, it had to be put online. Those commodity data tables are not current. And so if you have clients in the coffee space, if their roasters didn't go buy 100,000 pounds on the open market a year ago as a hedge against inflation, then your coffee is going up. And so we have to figure out how to address that. So we're seeing third-party delivery companies very recently adding fuel surcharges. We've seen restaurants add charges for paper goods, service charges for 15 cents a ticket for to-go items. Sometimes that fits within your culture, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the guests care, sometimes they don't. But you can be very strategic about it. What I don't see are a lot of polls like, hey, how would you feel about this? Or how do you feel about evidence bags as to go? Is this going to be off-putting to you? Are you going to eat a hamburger out of an evidence bag or not? I personally think it's kind of interesting, and I would 100% do it. But my grandmother probably wouldn't do that. So we want to be counselors too. And I think it gives us a lot of opportunity to prove ourselves valuable beyond our training and expertise and experience in the legal field. Because if you have a broader understanding of the markets that matter to your clients, you'll simply be more valuable as a partner. And so with that, I open it for discussion.
I've got a question, but I'm crying first about the lobster roll price increase. That's my favorite.
We just just get Langostino and use your imagination.
That's what I need to do. Okay. David, talk to us just for a moment about what are you seeing in the ghost kitchen space?
So Grace talked a little bit about, Grace Yang talked about ghost kitchens on one of the recent online
Programs, yeah.
sessions that we did. And it was really good. So for those of you that may not know, ghost kitchens are spaces that have been built that are not necessarily at the corner of Main and Main. They're not created to drive traffic. They are commercial kitchens where either they're leased to different concepts, to one or more concepts to simply make a lot of food on in-house and sell it online through third-party delivery or for pickup, but they are not generated to the in-house guest experience. They don't have drive-throughs. They might have a window, a walk-up window. And so there is a company called Crave, C-R-A-V-E, there are a number of ghost kitchen companies that are trying to buy buildings, build these commercial kitchens, lease them out to 3 or 4 different concepts, put everything online, and sell a bunch of food through third-party delivery services. I've negotiated 2 or 3 of those contracts in the last 5 weeks, probably, with the Crave company and a couple of other these ghost kitchen concepts. It's pretty simple to put your own ghost kitchen together. And so if you go lease a building, maybe in the industrial side of town, and you don't need a prime commercial space, and you put all 3 of your concepts into that space. So you take all your economies of scale in ordering and employment you only have back of the house because you don't have any front of the house, and you simply sell for delivery. It can be pretty economical. It can also be a nice way to get into a new area of town or a new city that you don't have a market presence in. And so I am not a huge fan because I am more an experiential eater, but there are people who want to have the ability to simply go on the app and order from 3 or 4 different places that it's made on the correct side of town, so it takes 20 minutes to get instead of an hour and 20 minutes.
I'm negotiating a ghost kitchen agreement right now, and it showed up, and it's in the form of a license agreement. And then I read it, and it talks about imposing brand standards and having inspection rights, and it reads just like a franchise agreement. So how are these exempt from franchise law? And it says that it is exempt, but I've done research and I can't find where it is or why it is.
Yeah.
Walks like a duck.
Yeah. It barks like a duck. So it's a trademark license, and they're going to pay a royalty, and your client, if it's the brand, is going to have control over. So it's a disguised franchise. But what the main distinction is that they're not giving them an operating manual necessarily. They're pretty much giving them recipes. So the thing you have to remember on that is the brand, sort of the F&B concept, is the one with the potential right of rescission. If it's an illegal franchise, they are going to be, well, that's not true. They might be the illegal franchisor, and the ghost kitchen might have the right of rescission. That's a potential problem, but there's so little control over. You're not going to have look and feel. You're not going to have, you're not going to have sort of red injection molded plastic booths there that fit a brand standard. And so it really will just be the F&B. You're not going to train the employees. You're just going to give them the manual and say, here's the recipe, here's how to do it. You probably have the ability to spot check it, secret shop it, but I think it lacks a lot of the indicia of a true franchise simply because it's so limited in scope. The best way to get out of it is to say they're not going to pay you any money for 6 months. That is the one safe harbor from being an illegal franchise. If no money changes hand for 6 months, then you're not. course, nobody wants that.
Even in this instance, they're actually training employees. They have to go to the brand's training sessions and things like that. So
Wow.
in this instance, and this is a big ghost kitchen outfit, you would know them.
Yeah.
And apparently this form's been used by all kinds of other brands, and I'm just shocked. I mean, I'm going to look to them to really provide the exemption, but it like Steven was saying, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a franchise. I mean, I
Yeah.
really don't see how it's
Well,
any different,
the
at least
good-
the way this one's written.
The good thing about the really large scale national brands is that they are going to probably fall within large franchise or large franchisee exemption in terms of net worth and or dollar spent on the unit. And so those exemptions may kick in too. But also, like, I'm not even thinking about what happens in the 14 bugaboo franchise states that have their own like really draconian franchise regulatory structures. I'm just thinking about the other ones that are quasi-normal.
We got to wrap it up. Thank you very much, David Denney.